Welcome, everybody, to the Talk With Kiet podcast, where we connect people, ideas, and capital to make a difference in the world. Today, I am so blessed to be on with Charles Poliacof. Charles is an amazing dude who I've got the pleasure to get to know over the last few months. Charles was the former CEO of Knoema, and not every day where you actually can talk about someone going through the journey of finding the next big move in life and actually discuss it live on a podcast. So Charles, thank you for volunteering to this. Everyone, Charles.
Kit, first of all, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm humbled at the fact that you even asked me. It's oftentimes when I meet folks, I'm like, my life is not that interesting, but apparently interesting enough to be able to talk about it here today. So thank you. It's been an interesting journey. I have this thesis that I thought about this a long time ago that, you are at the end of the day, this sort of unique aggregation of experiences and influences. That's how I think about, how I define myself in my life. Right. So I've always felt like surround yourself with the most amazing, diverse, different perspectives as you possibly can, because that helps enrichen your perspective and your life. And do as much cool shit as you possibly can, right? I think there was a movie once, Yes Man, where it's like, yes, I can do this. Yes, I can do that. Yes, I have to do this. I've sort of embraced that as well, where it's like, just take a flyer on things. And you obviously can't dilute your focus and your time, but at the same time, think about what those things are and how to enrich in your life. So anyway, happy to be here and thank you for having me.
So with that thought, right, we usually start the podcast with the background and the journey of the entrepreneur.
Yep.
So tell the audience about your career journey, how you got started.
So, when I was much, much younger, I actually thought I was going to be a musician. I thought I was going to I used to jump up and down on the bed with a tennis racket thinking I was going to be a rock star. And I was a classically trained pianist, and I was really passionate about playing, performing, writing, all those things. The coolest thing I ever did is I got to open up for Sting at sort of a much smaller concert. He did this venue, the Metropolitan Club. And we had sent in some audition tapes, and we knew some folks that were connected to him, and we actually got accepted, and we got to play, and we played I think a 20-30 minute set, and it was the coolest thing I've ever done, right? Having to do sound check and Sting. I remember I was so nervous I broke a guitar string right on stage because I was strumming so hard, but it was cool. But anyway, I thought that was going to be my life. And, I studied economics and applied mathematics. I went to SUNY Stony Brook, and, I thought I was going to be a musician. I got into a really bad jet ski accident in my early 20s, shattered my leg. I have titanium rods still in it, 2 screws in my knees, 2 screws in my ankles. And it was tough because I spent a lot of time in bed. And I spent a lot of time first reading, and I was in excruciating pain because I had shattered the thing and I just couldn't walk. Even getting up and going to the bathroom was brutal. At one point I just stopped eating because in my head I was like, if I just don't eat, I don't have to go and I could just sit here. Things that you go through when you're taking painkillers. Anyway, I spent a lot of time thinking about my life, and I just, I was worried that the journey wasn't there. And I was also worried about what was motivating me to be a musician. So I really started rethinking my life, and I had friends in Wall Street. I knew folks that were involved. So I started talking to them. And as I got better, I started doing more informational interviews and getting involved in all kinds of discussions. And at some point I thought I was going to work for a firm called Herzog Hein Geduld, where they were market makers. And they were acquired by Merrill Lynch. And I remember after the acquisition, they fired everybody. But anyway, before that happened, I knew somebody at the Mercantile Exchange who told me, hey, go work for Steven Schoenfeld and go meet this guy, Dmitry Balyazny, and go do that. And, the guy was the holy one. I mean, he ended up owning 33 seats on the CME and sold it for $1 gazillion. But anyway, he was somebody that I really respected, and he was kind of almost like a mentor at the time. So I ended up working at Schoenfeld through a lot of cold calling and trying to get myself in there. I started there in the late 90s, first proprietary trading, but then started getting into the whole algorithmic trading scene. And it was very, very early on at the time. You have to understand, like in the late 90s, early 2000s, you still had market makers, right? You still had specialists on the floor. Now you walk through the New York Stock Exchange and it's basically a tourist attraction. But back then there were specialists on the floor. So there was always opportunities, right? There was massive price dislocation before all of that was arbed out by kind of like high frequency trading and a lot of the algorithmic trading that exists today.
And you need to know math, right? Because it was fractional as well back then, right?
Yeah, no, the NASDAQ had just started. They started talking about decimalization, which actually was the death knell of the market makers and the specialists. As a matter of fact, when I spoke to my buddy, he said, these guys are all going to get decimalized. Their margins are going to go to zero and their businesses are going to be gone. They're going to become the glass blowers of the modern age, right? So, we started learning a little bit about algorithmic trading. We started looking at skill set analysis, like what are traders good at? What are they bad at? How do we kind of like turn that into a center book? How do we take the analytics that we've kind of like developed over time and build that into a strategy? So I got to work a bit with that group, and that was really, really fun. At one point, I decided to go out and do it on my own. And, I had a pretty decent career with Schoenfeld, and they were great over there. And I'm grateful for the opportunity they gave me. And they really gave me a lot of leeway to experiment with different strategies and to work with different groups. And, it was just a phenomenal experience with the Schoenfeld group in terms of like career development and giving me opportunities to grow. But at some point, I don't know what it is. I had I've always had a little bit of the entrepreneur bug. So at some point I said, you know what, let me see if I can do this on my own. There are people I think that have a low risk tolerance, right? Like my wife and I talk about it all the time. She's like, I need a steady job. I need 9 to 5. I just need to know that. And then there are people that have high risk tolerance. And I think when you work in a trading environment, you have to be very comfortable being uncomfortable, because you can go to bed one day and wake up and your longs are in your face and your shorts are in your face and the market's up 10 basis points and you don't understand how you're down 800, right? So that just happens. So you have to get comfortable being uncomfortable. And I think through that experience, I got to develop a pretty high risk tolerance, right? Which I think is maybe a necessary trait for being an entrepreneur. I think you also have to be, extraordinarily idealistic. So when everybody says you're crazy, you have to feel like you're sane. When everybody's running out of a burning building, you have to be very comfortable running in, right? So having all those, I guess, call them traits or, psychoses, one or the other. But having all those traits, I said, look, let me try and spin this on my own and see what I can do. So I went out on my own, had a very successful 2008, and only to get utterly decimated in 2009. And that was the first real lesson in what I would call violent regime shift, right? So everything we had known about all of our strategies, our approaches, the analytics that we used, everything just stopped working, and it stopped working overnight. Like imagine you wake up in the morning and you expect the sun to be there, except for the rest of your life, it never comes out again. Right. And I think at the time I had a little too much hubris and a little too much competitive spirit. There's the old adage of like, you have to pick your battles. I think back then I was just happy to pick any battle. I was like, yeah, I'm going to go fight that gigantic 10-foot swamp monster with a bow and arrow. And he has a club the size of a, redwood tree. Anyway, pretty much got decimated there. And at some point had to, pack it up and look for a job. And I was very lucky that, I found this group, Centurion. They were just starting out and they were looking for kind of like a head trader to kind of like anchor the group. And I worked with another gentleman over there by the name of Alan Rothstein. And he and I sort of like built the team and built the group together. And, you had to sort of like build from the ashes, right? Because at some point I was thinking I was going to be done in the next, 5-6 years. And then I went from that feeling to, here we go, got to start over again, right? Humbling experience, started over there, had a very, I would call it a relatively successful run, in that we did well, company did well. We grew to a bunch of people. They ended up merging with another company. And at that point, like, the fit was no longer there for me. So I decided to step down and start another fund. So at that point, I was like, okay, I've got my, I've got my foundation back underneath me. I've got a little wind in my sails. Let me see if I can go out and do this again. And I started with 4 other folks that I was working with. So there were 5 of us. And we actually called our fund 5 Points Investment Management. I was very proud of that name. It was New York centric. We had a cool star logo. But it was, I think this was 2011, 2010. And the fundraising in 2011, actually, and the fundraising environment was awful. So I had, we had built at that time, we were quantamental. So I remember, like, we went to the market with this sort of like quantamental investment thesis. And a lot of folks would just call me and be like, what the hell is quantamental? Like, what is that?
You were like 5-10 years early. That's what happened.
No, we were, you'll see that I'm often early. I'm often very early. So, we were out there with this quantamental approach, and we got a lot of interest and a lot of, folks inquiring about what we were doing, but we had a tough time closing like significant enough capital to support 5 mouths. So I also at the time had a stack of servers in my baby room. So I lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in New York City. One was for my wife and I. The other one was going to be for my firstborn son, who was, a few months away from being born. He was born April 2012. So I guess this was probably, middle to end of 2011. And I don't know if you've ever had Dell Blade 2 1950 or 60 servers in your house, but imagine 5 vacuum cleaners being on all at once. And that's what it sounded like in that room, to the point where my wife was like, get this out or I'm calling the doorman and I'm having him get it out for you. So I said, okay, time to go. I called my friend Basil Kanibi, who was the CEO of Knoema, and I was friendly with all 3 founders. So Basil Kanibi, Stan Altschuler, and Rishi Khanna, all very dear, close friends of mine today. And we had an amazing journey together. I remember saying, hey, Basil, can I bring my servers over and just keep them in your server rooms? I got no place for them. He said, sure. And I lived on 58th and 2nd, and their office was 59th and Lex. So I was happy to just pile everything onto a dolly and wheel it on over. Anyway, we got into a whole conversation, Basil and I. And, what was supposed to be a half-hour catch-up turned into like a 3-hour deep dive on like, everything that's, I wouldn't say wrong with the investment industry, but like from an asset management perspective, people were not using data nearly enough to really understand their core competencies, right? So you would have an investment manager that would say, and our secret sauce is our exposure management. Meanwhile, you look at the data and they lose about 1,700 basis points per year on investment, on exposure management, right? Yeah. There were other funds. I remember looking at a top hedge fund. There's 60 billion today. Their secret sauce is actually the portfolio manager's ability to go from like weighting his positions from like 50 basis points to 750 basis points, right? It wasn't stock picking, because if you equally weighted all of his positions over time, the fund generated a massive amount of negative alpha, right? So Basil had come up with, and this was also part and parcel of what we were doing as well, around like how you think about core competencies and data and how it relates to understanding the value that a manager brings. But like the stories weren't there, right? People were talking in terms of like returns, risk adjusted returns, and maybe you had Brinson, right? And that was it. And so the idea was to bring a differentiated view to the portfolio manager, but also a differentiated view to the asset owner, so they could have a much better conversation around what the core competencies are, but also have visibility into what you're investing into at the end of the day. So anyway, I'm going off on a tangent here. Basil said, hey, why don't you come work here? And I was like, what do you guys do? Like, and I thought at the time, like, I'm going to come in here and I'm going to show these guys, what to do. right? Because I had a couple of successes, nothing major, but like a couple of successes. And I was going to come in and show these guys how it's done. And Kit, there's a thing called imposter syndrome. And then there's just imposter. And I felt like at that point, you're very, very humbled when you realize how little you know when you've only worked in one field doing one thing for so long. Like I knew nothing about selling products, building products, hiring people that weren't slinging money around, right? Like there was so little I knew. And, I went from like, hey, I'm going to, show these guys how to do it to like, hey, I hope I don't get thrown out of here in the next 90 days because I suck at everything. But, I think the one thing I learned in 2009 that was really helpful for me here was like, don't worry about having the answers because you're going to be, even if you think you have them, you don't. Start focusing on having frameworks through which you can derive the answers. And that led to a whole bunch of different experiments that led to a whole bunch of different successes and failures. But what we learned is like, succeed fast, fail fast, but like, don't be afraid to try, right? Because you think about it, I can do the math for you, but I'm going to spare you the time because otherwise we'll be here all day. But like, you can take a lot more at-bats and have an experimentation framework that allows you to be able to get to a yes or a no versus like having a much more like, hey, we're only going to take 1 or 2 at-bats and we're going to bet it all on these things. And we're going to be 90% certain that they're going to be successful. When in reality, you're probably 50% right at best. So you want those at-bats. So anyway, long story short, we stumbled into Challenger. We stumbled into content marketing. We stumbled into the jobs to be done approach to building products. And, look, I think when I joined Novus, I think the revenue was like, somewhere between $1 million and $2 million. And at one point we got to almost 20 million. So yeah, I mean, it was an amazing journey. And eventually Novus got sold to SEI and, that was in the news. And, I had such a good relationship with the founders that even after I left, they let me keep my options for forever. Right. And I think that's a testament to the culture that they had built and a testament to the relationship and the trust we had built between us. Right. Like there was never a me in the equation. It was how do we make Novus successful? Anyway, around 2015, 14, I started getting the itch again. And I was working on some natural language processing stuff on the side. And the idea was like, and we'll talk about that because I think it's important for people to always be engaged in things that are intellectually interesting, because that's what drives us at the end of the day, right? I think before we went live, you and I were talking about utility a little bit, utility curves, right? Anyone remembers from microeconomics, this concept of a utility curve. And, you have to start to think about what are the things that you value. Is it just money? Like, is it just a job? And is the goal getting an outcome? Or are you so passionate about this that you're singularly threaded and focused? Or do you have other diverse interests? And for all of us, they can run the gamut. For me at this stage of my life, my kids are 11, 9, and 5. So the things that I value the most are time spent with them, getting to go to Little League games. My 2 boys are crazy athletes. So, getting to go to all their games, whether it's basketball, soccer, football, getting to coach. I got to coach my kids basketball. I get to coach my kids football. So those are things that I value. So going back to Novus, one of the things that I valued was working on intellectually interesting projects. And what we were doing at Novus was very, very interesting. I don't want to downplay that at all. But I'd started experimenting with natural language processing and this idea that you could extract meaning from unstructured content using NLP, right? Which now everyone's doing that with ChatGPT and the advent of AI and everything else. But, going back to 2014, 15, there wasn't a whole lot of that going on, right? You had AlphaSense a little bit, which was using really synonyms, and it built a really cool product doing that. You had Sentio that, had sort of built something like that too, although they had a lot of functionality at Sentio. And that was really it. And we really wanted to build a very differentiated view using a very atomic approach to building NLP. The problem is if you build NLP at a very general level, it gets really, really brittle after a while, right? Like, and if you use keywords, imagine doing shareholder friendly capital allocation policy using keywords. Imagine the amount of gunk you're going to get back. Because at the end of the day, what are you really looking for? You're really looking for someone that's going to be increasing their dividends, doing a share buyback, right? That has nothing to do with those words individually, right? I look for the word shareholder, I'm going to get a million results. So we were looking to build something like that. Around the same time, I met another really, one of the things that I've been really lucky about is I've met some really amazing people in my journey, and I've kept all those relationships along the way. But I got to meet Mike Stepanovich, who had just started a company called One Access. And the idea was to derive value out of bank content. It was going to be built as a banking consortium. And I got to meet Gary Offner, who at the time was running principal strategic investments for Morgan Stanley. So the company was seeded by Morgan Stanley. And the idea was to get BAML, UBS, and Citi to come along and form kind of like a banking consortium around the project. And I met him, and the idea was banks have a lot of content, right? But they need to be able to connect to their customers in a more meaningful way, right? Because back then, the dissemination mechanism was the inbox and the telephone, right? And a lot of times, a research salesperson's role was often reduced to a lot of administrative function. So you had a lot of very highly paid, highly capable people who were doing sort of more low-level work. So how do you kind of like introduce that value equation back into the interaction with their customers, right? They didn't really have that platform. The closest thing they had at the time was a company called themarkets.com, but they ended up selling that to S&P.
Right.
And then once they sold that, they kind of lost that channel with the customer again. It was always the vendor and the customer. So One Access was this idea of like, how do you bring together corporate access? MiFID II was on the horizon. So we were looking at, consumption data and using a much more analytics approach to understanding the value you were deriving from your sell-side relationships. And then also bringing research back into the ecosystem, and also thinking about, hey, if I'm a bank and I own this research, how can I monetize it through all these different distribution channels, right? Sort of like a syndication model, right? Because you have real-time research that has value to the customer, but then there's embargoed research, which is released later on, which has value to a different set of customers, right? So how do you optimize that revenue, right? And how do you do it in a way where it's collaborative across the banks, but there isn't collusion? And the idea was like, it's got to be about building something that's good for the ecosystem as a whole. And we were partnering with buy-side firms. Anyway, long story short, because gosh knows I can go off on tangents here. Long story short, I ended up joining forces with Mike, and One Access was born. And it was really cool because it was really just the three of us in this office in what's now called Nomad. And, I think it was like 27th and Broadway. And we really built this whole platform up. The banks came in. We built this consortium. We started getting some really, really big customers, like the biggest asset managers in the world, the biggest hedge funds in the world. And they were our partners on this. So it wasn't just about selling to them. It was about elevating the ecosystem, right? Elevating the workflows, right? And it was great that I'd had that Novus experience, because at this point, we had a pretty good understanding of what jobs to be done was all about. I remember John Liu joined us too, and he was our head of product, and he came with that same sensibility. And he was another just amazing person to work with, another person that is a dear friend of mine today. And, so we started building that. We ended up getting merged with another banking consortium. So if you think about the main content sets in a bank, right, on research sales, it's corporate access, it's research itself, it's, the interactions data, and then it's models. And the idea behind Visible Alpha was actually a brilliant one. And I credit a couple of the board members from the banks on this. Barry Hurwitz, one of the smartest guys I ever met. The idea was, too many people look at EPS, but EPS doesn't really tell the full story. If I'm looking at Netflix, right, and I want to talk to the analyst, what I want to understand is where the investment controversies are. So you can have two analysts that have the same view on revenue and EPS, but they can have radically different views on how they got there, right? If I'm looking at Netflix, maybe I think it's international streaming, and maybe I think international streaming is going to grow because the number of users is going to explode. Maybe I think that there's, a lot of price elasticity to the goods. So, it's going to grow because we can just keep increasing prices. And you can't get that by looking at an EPS number. And you can't get that without understanding what consensus is at each of the different KPI levels, right? And then being able to look back and understand how to compare those things. So Visible Alpha was a brilliant, brilliant concept. And, the journey there was like connecting the ecosystem. We needed to get the content from the banks, and we needed to get user adoption, right? Because early on with Visible Alpha, when you're in the mind of a user, you're a nice to have sale. When somebody's been doing something the same way for a long time, it's a very hard journey to get them to understand that, like, hey, there's a differentiated approach. So, I forget how the hype cycle works with Gartner, but like early on, you need, the early adopters, right? The folks that are, unhappy with the status quo. And then eventually you get to mainstream. And eventually there's a tipping point where you go from being something that people feel they might need or could be an edge to, oh crap, everybody has this. How come we don't? We're at a disadvantage. Now we have to have it. And it's a different machine you need to build for those types of things as well. So anyway, I'm kind of jumping around, but just going in chronological order. The companies merged together. I became chief revenue officer of the firm, and I had to build an entire practice from scratch. And early on, it was about hiring people that could get their hands dirty, evangelize, and develop a really deep conceptual inventory to be able to tell the story of Visible Alpha and how it improves the workflow. And what was nice is this was really well suited for the challenger model. So having kind of, honed some of our thinking and philosophies around sales approach at Novus, bringing challenger model here was a really natural fit. So, look, Visible Alpha is a huge business today. And I was delighted to have been a pretty decent part of that. And, but at some point when you're 500 people and you're bringing two different cultures together, like at some point, views change, priorities change, things just change. So it reached a point where I think it was time for, the Visible Alpha team to kind of take the assets, and eventually Mike and I left. And this is now 2018. And I'd spent a little bit of time poking around in blockchain. I was introduced to crypto and blockchain almost 10 years prior. But at this point, it started taking more of a hold. And, folks are trying to figure out how to make mainstream use cases out of it, right? The thing that I found interesting, though, was like everybody wanted to be the ecosystem, right? But like you can't create a network effect when everyone's trying to create their own network effect and compete against networks, and there's no way to connect the networks, right? It's actually antithetical. So like a lot of it just didn't make sense to me. I was like, okay, you're going to build this thing, and you want to be the ecosystem, but there's like 50 other people vying to be the same thing with partnerships. And like, how is, I'm going to make things up here, but how is like JP Morgan coin on JP Morgan blockchain going to work with Goldman Sachs coin on Goldman Sachs blockchain when they don't communicate with one another? Like, doesn't that like eviscerate the whole like money velocity, liquidity thesis? Like, isn't that like really sort of like the opposite way of approaching that? So
there's no single dealer platforms, right, that you see in fixed income, right, historically, or FX, which
exactly. So, it was an interesting time, but I did, as I was exploring options, one of the things I always wanted to do was kind of like run a company. I don't know if it was ego or if it was like, I'd always had this desire to do more and more and more and more and more, right? Which is kind of different to where I am now, but we'll talk about that in a bit. But like, I really wanted to go through that journey, feel that pain. We talked about life is your aggregation of experiences and influences. This is an experience that I knew I needed and I wanted and just had to have. It was driving me. So I came across a company called Knoema. I was on Vista's executive bench. I got to take a few, fun tests to be able to get on there. And I was on Vista's executive bench, and there was a gentleman there by the name of Joe Letween. He was at the Data Intelligence Group, and it wasn't a Vista investment, but it was a company that he had known. And he said, look, you should check out Knoema. They've got some really great technology, but they're struggling with go-to-market and, kind of like helping people understand the value prop. And I said, sure, let me go check this out. So I came in, took a look at the company, got a demo, got a story, and I just felt like the use cases that they were talking about were disconnected from what the market actually needed, right? And I shared that with the investors, and we had a lot of conversations. They wanted to bring me on, I think, as a consultant, and I said, look, why don't we just go have some conversations? So I brought them. At that point, I'd known, at that point, this Bluff had 12 investment banks in the cap table, and it's all public, right? And I was very, very close to a lot of our board members, a lot of the big banks, and I'm still very fortunate to have some of those relationships today. Some of them I really call good friends. And, I just said, hey, would you guys mind taking a look at this? Right. So I just took it to a few of the big banks, and I took it to a few of the big asset managers. And folks were like, why doesn't this exist? This should exist. This should be here, right? Like everyone was trying to build connectivity to data, right? Like crazy concept. This is now 2019. Snowflake is barely off the. I mean, Snowflake was already become was a growing company, but this idea of the data cloud, what really wasn't like as prevalent as it is today. So people were like managing their own data pipelines. People were connecting to all these different data assets. People had massive teams, either locally or overseas, mostly overseas, doing a lot of this as well. People were manually stitching data together. And then people were building integrations into all these different visualization tools, sometimes building it themselves, which I never, ever understood. I never understand the build versus buy when what you're building provides zero competitive advantage or differentiation to your competitors. Like someone will have to explain that to me one day, because I just don't.
Yeah, exactly.
But anyway, so I said, look, why don't we take a flyer with this thing? And I became the CEO of Knoema, and it was an amazing journey. I mean, we bought a company called Adaptive Management. I think I was 2 weeks on the job, and we found an opportunity, and we ended up making a play there. And then somewhere along the way, there's some big obstacles too. I think I endured 2 7 Sigma events during my tenure at Knoema. One was COVID, which was, a lot of companies struggled there. We had funding, then we didn't, then we had different funding. Fortunately, at the end, we were really, really lucky. We ended up partnering with Eldridge. We had Todd Bowley, Michelle Troney, Tony Manila, just amazing people. I mean, you want to talk about being lucky to be able to interact with them. There was just an amazing experience with them. And then Snowflake became an investor as well. So, being able to work closely with their corp dev team and still have relationships there, it was really, really great. But, it wasn't without a lot of strife and turmoil. And the other big issue we had is we had a US team, an India team, and a Russia team. And then during the Russia crisis, we just couldn't pay our Russia staff anymore, right? Because of sanctions. So we moved some folks to Armenia, but we had to do a massive shift. Anyway, I don't want to go too much into detail there, but that was another big Seven Sigma event. But we did end up buying a company called Seek Data, so if you think about Knoema does data connectivity, data unification, and then sort of like workflow integration. And there's a ton of use cases. If you're interested, we can talk through. But what was hard about the Knoema sale is we were still selling infrastructure and technology to end users. And if you think about any enterprise sale, it's always going to be one of 3 things: transformation, efficiency, or top line. And top line always drives the needle the most. Like if someone has an opportunity to make more money, they can do that. And we were either part of your digital transformation sale or your efficiency play. So harder sale and long sales cycle, and you're always competing, build versus buy. And oftentimes the people you're selling to are the ones that are building the solution that you're competing against, right? So when we found Seek Data, what they did is they were kind of like this fourth pillar of capability that we could bring to the stack, which was this idea of packaged business insights. So if I'm a CPG company and I have a relationship with a Walmart, right, I have to meet certain inventory thresholds. Well, first of all, if I drop below certain inventory thresholds, it could mean tens of millions of dollars of lost revenue to me, but also it can mean potential fines below a certain revenue threshold. So, what Seek was doing was they were building predictive out of stocks models or customer 360 or other sort of like packaged business insights that consisted of connectivity to a subset of data, a data model, right, that was unifying those data assets together, and then workflow integration, whether it's a Tableau or a ThoughtSpot or a Sigma. But what that allowed us to do is we were able to partner more closely with Snowflake, right? Because their retail CPG folks are constantly thinking about utility on the Snowflake ecosystem. But it also allowed us to partner more closely with the data vendors, because data vendors at the end of the day, you know all about this probably better than most people, Kit. Like data vendors at the end of the day, what do they care about? They care about making sure that people use their data, right? Because if you're a data vendor, the worst thing that can happen to you is, well, not the worst, but some of the bad outcomes that can happen to you is somebody buys your data and never uses it because they don't understand the value. They don't know how to connect the value with the use case. So we were helping to do that through Seek. And then if you're a ThoughtSpot or a Sigma or a Tableau or any of the other solutions, people are constantly in your solution because they're deriving value from the unified data assets and the data underneath. And you can tell your story with data, right? So for us, it was a great acquisition. Eric Mitchell was an amazing asset. He's such a great guy. And, fortunately for us, the Seek thing started really getting traction. But at some point, like, I don't know if I'm the guy that's going to go to Bentonville and opine on predictive out of stocks analytics as it relates to your, Walmart relationship. So, I think it was time for Knoema to have a change. And, I'd gotten Knoema to that point. So I stepped down in December, transitioned out, and I've spent the last 5 months just, really some amazing stuff out there. But let me pause. I think I've been talking for about 32 minutes straight. So
this is great. I mean, you provide a lot of insights to that journey, and the way I see it is the journey of maturing and evolving and understanding of who you are.
Yeah.
And right now you're at a phase where you have the freedom to then decide your next move. And it's really about, is it about based on the things you care about, based on your skill set, based on the future metric, right? Because we typically look at metric as how much money you're going to make, how much money you have.
Yep.
But as we age, we realize that there's actually other set of metrics we need to look at, and it's not about money, right? So talk to the audience a bit about how you're weighing that and the concept of, the marginal extra dollar, right? That was a great point you raised when we were catching up offline.
Yeah. So look, I think everyone has a number that they need to, for their family, right? Like my kids go to sleepaway camp. That's expensive. We have to save up for college. That's expensive. We live in a high tax neighborhood. That's expensive, right? So you have that sort of like baseline of expenses that you need to meet to be able to take care of your family and make sure that you have those things. I think after that, you start to look at the, every incremental dollar. You and I talked about the marginal dollar, right? The value of the marginal dollar. I think that's going to be different for a lot of people, and I think it all depends on what drives you and what you value and what's important to you. And I've found as I've gotten older, look, I've got a 5 or 6 year window. I think I talked about this before, and I want to maximize that window. To me, that has infinitely more value than, working 10 extra hours a week or going after a job that requires an enormous amount of travel. Maybe it pays me a lot more, but it requires a lot of travel. So I'm going to miss out on those opportunities. So I think everyone's got to ask themselves, like, once you have sort of like that baseline, what are those sacrifices you're willing to make to, drive a $250,000 car versus a used Honda Civic. I'm using extremes, but hopefully you get my point. Or, buying that vacation home. Like, what are those trade-offs? Now, for some people, those trade-offs are worth it. And I'm certainly not judging anybody. At the end of the day, what most folks, at least what I've learned, is it's really important to understand who you are through the lens of what you value. Because once you understand that, it helps you drive your interactions with people. For example, I once took a Hogan personality test, and it's really interesting. I learned a few interesting things about myself. I learned that I could give two shits about credit, meaning like I don't need someone to be like, "Attaboy, that was awesome, you were great." Like, I literally could care less. Like, I don't need the credit. I don't need somebody to say Charles did this. Like, it doesn't matter. I'm happy to disappear in the background. Like, I only care about the outcome, right? Most would say, wow, it's a great trait, right? It's actually a terrible trait as a manager. Do you know why? Because you don't give people credit either.
That's
you
right.
don't give people attaboys. Your expectation levels are here all the time because you expect people are going to deliver, right? So it can make for a challenging environment if you're a manager. And I've had to check myself a few times, right, in order to do that. So that's an example of, like, you have to know who you are through the lens of what you value if you truly want to understand how to optimize your potential. There's a pretty good book, Damien, by Herman Hesse. Talks about, like, I read a lot of Herman Hesse when I smashed my leg. But it talks about, like, we all are these good and bad traits together, right? And we have to sort of accept that about ourselves. And we want to accentuate those things that are amazing, but we also want to be aware of, like, I have no patience. Like, I need to work on that, right? For the rest of my life, that's going to rear its head, right? So we all need to be aware of these things. And, we constantly need to work on making sure that, we either understand our checks, like our like early warning signs, right? And sometimes it's not getting enough sleep. Sometimes it's being overly caffeinated. For me, I need to work out regularly. It gives me a lot of clarity. Or I need to spend some time outside because I enjoy that connectivity. Like, whatever it is, right? You need to know that about yourself. So anyway, I've spent the last 5 months really thinking about, like, what I value, what's important to me. And I've come to the realization that, like, for me, like, once my family is okay, like, spending time with my family, spending time on things that are intellectually interesting, spending time with people that are teaching me things, or there's a reciprocal relationship where I'm learning from them and they're learning from me, right? Spending time on not only intellectually challenging projects, but challenging projects. I like meaty, challenging things. I always have, right? If it's easy, it's kind of boring, right? So I've always, like, so as I start to think about the things that I value, and lastly, like, I had to check my ego at the door. Do I want to be a CEO again? And if you asked me 3 months ago, I would have said 100% yes. Now that I've thought about it, like, when you're a CEO, and this, and anyone that's a CEO that's listening to this knows this as well, even when you're not working, in your head, you're working. You're at the family dinner table, right? It's Thanksgiving. Everyone's talking about all these different things. You know what you're thinking about? Something that went wrong at work yesterday. You're just not present. You're at your kid's Little League game. You're at your kid's basketball game, right? You're there, but you know where you are? You're on the phone. You're on email. You're constantly engaged. When you go to bed, your wife is having a conversation with you, maybe you're listening, maybe you're not, right? Because at the end of the day, you're engaged. So to me, that to some extent represents lost time. And I'm not at this stage of my life willing to sacrifice that time with my family in order to give that up. So whatever I do next, that's going to have to, factor into the decision making. And it's a tough decision for me to make. And, again, everyone goes through their journey and their own approach, but, being as open and transparent as I can, like, that's really going to factor in my decision making going forward. But there is a lot of cool opportunity, man. Like, the Snowflake ecosystem with all the native apps, this idea of being able to build a native application that drives utility on top of Snowflake, like you don't need a whole lot of capital to be able to build something like that, right? There's so many interesting companies that have great tech, but struggle to be able to either tell their story or create a new category around their technology. Like there's an art to that. So, those are the types of things that I've been attracted to, or even, looking at the technology and data landscape where there's a lot of different companies, but maybe like they make more sense in the context of another asset. So how do you kind of like build a new, company that is comprised of all these different like functions and features from different companies, where maybe 1 + 1 + 1 = 7, right? As opposed to 3 individually. So those are the types of things that I've been looking at, and I've had a lot of great conversations. And the one thing that I've done for the last, I guess, 4.5 months is just meet as many new people as I can. Again, going back to that, we are this aggregation of experiences and influences.
That's right.
Meeting a lot of new people. And I want to also give a shout out to Sam Jacobs and the folks over at Pavilion. I've been doing a lot of continuing ed and just immersing myself in like things like coursework. Like I learned about JOLT methodology, which is about indecision science. I would have never done that ever, ever before this, this time. So having the opportunity to, learn new things, constantly expose myself to new people, and be really, really open-minded. I had a cup of coffee, my cup is now empty. And I think too many people go through their day. I don't want to judge people. I think I too often went through my day cup full. And now I start my day every day, cup completely empty. What else can I drink in? What else can I fill this up with? What else can I learn? Who else can I meet? What else is out there? It's been a really cool, like divergent process, but you can go back and still converge around themes that are relevant or important to you. So I've got some cool stuff on the hopper that I can't talk about yet, but as it comes out, folks will be able to see it on LinkedIn or read about it or whatever. So,
but mindset is so important. I think you highlight the importance of having a learn it all mindset and then share it all mindset.
Yeah.
Right? Because sharing also gets you back to learning and sharing. Like it's a cycle.
Yeah. I read something once. I don't know if it's true because gosh knows what's true anymore on the internet. But I read an interesting hypothesis to someone I proposed. So Cro-Magnon and Homo sapien were around at the exact same time. But for whatever reason, there was and supposedly, according to this article, Cro-Magnon was bigger, stronger, had a more developed cerebral cortex. So theoretically, it was smarter. Again, any anthropologist, if I'm misquoting anything, I apologize. I'm just regurgitating what I read, caveating it now. But anyway, the point is there was a part in Homo sapiens' brain that allowed them to be able to communicate. And there was this need to be social and share information. So, if I'm Cro-Magnon man and I realize that if I bury an egg, it lasts longer, I'm going to bury an egg. It's going to be great. But I'm not telling Kit because for whatever reason, I'm not wired to go tell Kit. But if I'm Homo sapien and I bury this egg, I'd be like, hey, dude, did you know that if you bury this egg, it's going to last so much longer? You should do that too. And you're like, oh my God, it's true. And then you go tell people. And then, so that's what allowed, at least according to this article, Homo sapien to be able to survive because they were able to share and communicate information in a way that was an evolutionary advantage and, allow them to withstand the hardships of what it was like, gosh knows how many millions of years ago, 100,000s of years ago. So anyway, I always thought that was a cool story, whether it's true or not, but I think it does fit into this conversation where it's like people need to share. And again, going back to the Pavilion thing, one of the things I loved about Pavilion is one day I was like, hey, I'm getting a bunch of consulting work and I don't know how to bill. I don't know how to like, I just don't know, does anybody out there can help me? Like 9 people reached out to me, 9. And they were like, oh, why don't I share? And they were so open kimono. And then they followed up with me, sending me emails. How's it going? Is there anything you can help with? So like, when you find those communities that are out there, there's a lot of value in tapping into them, right? You'd be amazed at how many perfect strangers are willing to help. And also me, like I'm very willing to help others. Like I volunteer at the FinTech Innovation Lab just because I get to meet cool companies, and if I can make an intro, I will. If I can help somebody get a client, I will. Like, these are the things you do because we're all at the end of the day fighting the same fight. So, we need all the help we can get.
No, exactly. But to summarize what I learned from you in this chat, and this may sound a bit spiritual, but
no, it's all good.
you could be the captain of your fate, and you could be the master of your soul. But you need to realize that life is coming from you and not at you.
Yeah.
And I think some people realize that.
Yeah. No, that's a great way of phrasing it. Look, we all go through this self-actualization journey.
Yeah.
And I just think it's important that we be honest with ourselves, good, bad, and different. I've made so many mistakes. It's crazy. But like, you have to learn from those mistakes, and you have to be kind to yourself. Just because you made mistakes doesn't mean you're like, a failure. Like, we're half wrong at best. Right. So that means we're going to be wrong all the time. We're going to get things wrong all the time. There's a buddy of mine, Matt Del Forno, over at Discovery, great guy. He's like, I remember one day he came to my office and he wrote the formula for kinetic energy on my whiteboard. He's like, velocity is the only thing that matters. Velocity, right? Because if you look at order of operations, it's mass times velocity squared. So where are you getting all the impact? It's on the velocity piece. And now I remember when I would do decks for my company, I would literally put the formula for kinetic energy on a slide. Everyone's looking at this thing and they're like, what are you talking about? But again, it's that idea that like things go fast. You have to move fast. You have to learn fast and be okay. Like, don't ascribe value to being right or wrong, right? Like, ascribe value in putting together a good process that allows you to get to the answer, right? I'm trying to think what movie talked about this. Moneyball a little bit, right? The whole journey, right? At the end when I think he's listening to that song, his daughter's, Billy Bean's daughter writes that song, like, you're such a loser, Dad, what was it? Just enjoy the show, right? Yeah. Just enjoy the show. And that's the whole thing, man. Like, again, not to get too spiritual, but like, enjoy the show. Some days are awesome and for no doing of your own. And some days suck for all of your doing of your own. And like, that's just part of it. Enjoy it all, the good and the bad. Because it goes by quick.
That's right.
I'm telling you, man, my son was born yesterday. Now he's 11. And I'm going to be thinking he's going to graduate college. And I'm going to be like, where the hell did it go? So the one thing I choose more than anything in the world, more than money, more than anything else, is to drink it all in and enjoy it. That's why I wake up every day with a smile on my face. People are like, dude, what's wrong with you? You have so much energy. I'm like, I don't know. I'm happy. I love life. Life is good.
Gratitude. I mean, that's the key.
Gratitude. Yeah.
Thank you, Charles. That was so insightful. That's a great conversation. I'm getting like great texts and message from people on
awesome
how helpful that discussion's been. Usually where we end this is really the last questions about, how can the audience help you? Like, what are the people you want to connect with? Who are the people you want to connect with, and how can the audience help you and reach out to you?
Look, I'm constantly looking to expand my network and connect with, entrepreneurs, investors, builders, buyers, right? Like, my journey right now, I'm working on several things at once, and to be able to either bounce those ideas off them, get the perspective. We talked about, like, I will end with this actually. So I'm a big fan of Hegel, and I'm a big fan of the Hegelian dialectic. Sorry, everyone at Novus. I know you guys heard me talk about this every day for like 4 years. Sorry, I'm going to talk about it again. But, this idea that like, I have an idea, you have a diametrically opposed different idea. And Dalio talks about this too, with like the way they communicate and the culture they built. But like, through those two ideas coming together, you get this higher understanding synthesis. Like, I once modeled it as the integral of cosine. Loser alert, I'm sorry. But that's how I modeled it. But if you think about it, if you draw the integral of cosine, it looks like a never-ending loop, right? Because it's like idea, counterpoint, higher understanding. New idea, counterpoint, higher understanding. So how can people help me? Like, challenge my thinking, man. Like, let's have a conversation. Let's have a dialogue. Like, how can we learn from one another? How can we explore opportunities with one another. Like maybe you have an idea where I can be helpful. Maybe I have an idea and I'd love to bounce it off you. So, I'm happy to connect to anyone that's interested.
Great. Thank you so much, Charles. And as usual, thank you to the audience for your continued support. Have a great weekend, everybody.
Kit, thank you so much for having me here today. Really enjoyed the conversation, and thank you. And thank you for everybody that tuned in and listened. Thank you very much. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Charles. Thank you, everybody.